In the first video, we talked about the opening of Romans. Now I want to move on to talk with you about the prayer of thanksgiving, the narration, and some of the other elements. First, let's talk about the prayer of thanksgiving. The transitional section of Romans begins with a prayer of thanksgiving. That's typical in a Pauline letter. The prayer in Romans, though, is not very long. It's contained in a single sentence in verse 8. Paul thanks God for all who belong to Christ in Rome, because your faith is proclaimed in all the world. A short and simple prayer that Paul could honestly pray for those he has not yet met, but has heard about. And what he has heard gives him cause for thanksgiving. Next comes the narration. The words in verses 9 through 14 hint in a preliminary way at the practical purpose of Paul's letter. They hint, but do not actually appeal yet for support for Paul, who hopes to travel to the west of the empire and preach the gospel in Spain. Paul has often wanted to come to Rome to meet women and men who have the kind of faith that is talked about in all the world, and share with them some gift that the Spirit will enable him to share. He explains he has often wanted and even prepared, made plans to come, only to be prevented. But now he's eager to come and preach the gospel in Rome to Greeks and barbarians, to the wise and the foolish. And there's nowhere better to do that than in the incredible diversity of people who live in the city of Rome, the capital of the empire. The population of Rome is estimated by scholars at this time at around 1 million people. And that population came to Rome from all over the empire Rome inherited from Greece, the empire of Alexander and its Greek culture, and from places beyond that, people who had never been cultured in what became Greco-Roman culture, and so are called barbarians. And while the first part of the narration is interesting, the last part of it is crucial. It's the proposition. It's found in Romans chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. I am not ashamed, Paul writes. And this is the first indication in Romans there were some who indeed sought to shame Paul. Whether they were in Rome or outside Rome, we cannot say, but Paul will call them slanderers in chapter 3 and verse 8, who falsely represent who he is and the message that he preaches. I am not ashamed of the gospel, Paul says. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith, for faith. As it's written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. Many sections in Romans will grow out of those words and that proposition, as Paul explains and expands the meaning of the proposition, demonstrates the significance of the proposition to him and to all God's beloved in Rome in the rest of the letter. For in fact, the whole body of the letter always builds on the main proposition of the letter. And here in Romans, it will prove that Paul is not ashamed of the gospel because it reveals God's power and righteousness. Second, Paul is not ashamed of the gospel because it reveals God's power for salvation and the righteousness that comes through faith and for faith. Third, Paul is not ashamed of the gospel because it reveals itself as good news for the Jew first and also for the Greek. And fourth and finally, Paul is not ashamed of the gospel because it reveals the fulfillment of God's word and the full realization of the meaning of the promise God spoke first to the prophet Habakkuk. The one who is righteous will live by faith. As Paul recalls the promise from Habakkuk chapter 2 and verse 4, as a Jew and as a Pharisee, he quotes only part of the verse. expecting those who hear it to remember not just the promise that he's quoting, but the thoughts of God through the prophet Habakkuk in the words that surround it. Even today, a Jew who has studied the Hebrew Bible will often do the same thing, quote part of a passage when they have in mind the whole. So here are the words of Habakkuk 2:4 in context, with some of the preceding context and some of the following context. Look at the proud, Habakkuk says. Their spirit is not right in them, but the righteous will live by faith. Moreover, wealth is treacherous. The arrogant do not endure. They open their throats wide as Sheol. Like death, they never have enough. They gather all nations for themselves and collect all peoples as their own. In every way, those words describe Rome and its empire in the mid-1st century. They describe its pride, its wealth, its arrogance, its appetites for food and pleasure, and its achievement, how they have gathered all nations for themselves, for their own benefit, and how they have collected all peoples as their own subjects. And now let's move on from the transitional section of Romans and say something about the body of Romans in a preliminary way. From the video lecture by Dr. Stacy you watched before this one, and you're reading in week 2 of our course about literary forms in the world of the New Testament, you've been introduced to rhetoric, the method of forming an argument to be presented through speech. You've also learned it was used not only for public speaking in the ancient world, but for writing letters. Paul understands and uses rhetoric in a number of ways as he composes his letters. And at least some of his letters give every indication they were products of his speaking them into existence, as an amanuensis wrote them down. As Paul's letters are read aloud, they demonstrate Paul's ability to use any or all of the 3 main parts of rhetoric. Ethos, to introduce the argument, the main or supporting proposition. Logos, to present the logic of the proposition and how it follows from premise to conclusion in the body of the argument. And pathos, to indicate how those who listen to the argument are meant to respond to it. As Paul's letters are read aloud, they demonstrate all of those 3 main parts of rhetoric. They also demonstrate any or all of the different types of rhetoric, forensic rhetoric, the rhetoric of the law court, to prosecute, to present and prove, or to defend by refuting opposing viewpoints, real or imagined. Deliberative rhetoric, the rhetoric of the assembly and legislature, to encourage a group of people to follow an argument, think it through as it progresses, and reach its conclusion. And epideictic rhetoric, to praise what is good or blame what is not. As you read through Romans, you can see any or all of those different types of rhetoric. And you can also see any or all of the 6 components of rhetoric: the introduction, the narration, the proposition, the confirmation, the refutation, and the conclusion. And as you heard about ancient rhetoric and the names of its component parts, as Dr. Stacy mentioned them to you in the video, and as I mentioned them to you just now, you may be wondering how a rhetorical analysis of a Pauline letter interfaces with its analysis as an ancient letter. If you did, you wondered your way into a debate that's been taking place among interpreters of Paul for quite a while now. Should we analyze Paul's letters rhetorically as speeches framed by a letter in terms of their opening and closing? Or should we analyze them as ancient letters that make use of rhetoric, primarily in their transition and in the body of the letter? Does Paul write letters that use rhetoric, or use rhetoric to produce a letter? It's very possible, I think, that if Paul was here and given those two alternatives and asked which was correct, he would say very quickly, both. But in any case, Paul's familiarity with the literary features associated with both ancient letters and rhetoric is obvious. As we learn about each of them, they enable us to understand and interpret Paul's message in his letters more fully and completely, each of the components of rhetoric. Romans is a case in point, for according to Romans 16:23, Romans is a document that was first spoken to an amanuensis named Tertius. And Romans also clearly contains an ancient letter opening, transition, and closing. But the transition contains a proposition that we've already talked about that's related closely to the rest of the body of the letter. And the body of the letter, in its different parts, reflects Paul's ability to use rhetoric powerfully to put forward arguments, to defend arguments, to put forward and defend himself, and to encourage those who listen to follow his logic and reach his conclusions. The body of the letter to the Romans does just that in 5 sections as I analyze it. Each section makes use of ethos, logos, and pathos. Each section shows traits associated with one or more of the 3 kinds of rhetoric: forensic, deliberative, and epideictic. And each section is organized rhetorically with its own proposition, arguments, and conclusion. And when I read and listen to myself read Romans out loud, as though I was the person, the lector, assigned to read it to my community of Christ followers, I gain a greater appreciation for both its message and the medium and the rhetoric to convey that message. And by the way, I encourage you to do this when you analyze a Pauline letter, to do what Paul intended and expected you to do. Read the words out loud and imagine that you are the voice of Paul, speaking those words on Paul's behalf to a group of Christians, to a house church, to a Christian community, and seeking to make the words that you say sound aloud as if Paul's voice is speaking them.